So we are here with Terrilee Kelford of Cornerstone Landing, who is one of our local partners that we at the Rural FASD Support Network have really had a great relationship with. And Terrilee is here to just give us a little bit of an update as to the state of youth homelessness within Lanark County and some of the things that she's currently seeing and dealing with. So thank you very much for joining us, Terrilee. Thanks for inviting me. It's great. It's nice to be able to have this technology. Actually, it seems to be bringing, in a strange way, bringing people together in many ways, so in a different context. So happy to be here. So I wear a few hats, actually. So in terms of my introduction, I'm the chair of Cornerstone Landing. People often confuse me with the executive director, but we have no money to pay for admin staff, so I'm essentially, so I just call myself a chair. So I volunteer my time to the program, but it's been a passion of mine for about 20 years in the county. Because of my history of working with kids in a variety of capacities. So I am also a registered psychotherapist, and I've also worked in residential care for children in the care of the child welfare system for the last almost 24 years now, actually. So so I bring all of that to my work with Cornerstone Landing. Certainly years ago, we recognized that there was a gap in the system and the services for young people, primarily who were over the age of 16. Because at the time they couldn't access, they could access very few supports, including the child welfare agency. So, and so there was really this group of kids, especially 16, 17-year-olds, who were being left with very few supports and services. So we pulled together a committee about 20 years ago in the county and started working or looking at ways to support young people who were experiencing homelessness. And I know in rural areas, another hat I wear actually is a co-chair of the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. So we're a national organization that's come together, communities, agencies, individuals from across the country to talk about the specific housing and homelessness situation in rural and remote communities across the country. So, so certainly in Lanark County, we're unique in the sense that we're one of only 2 counties in all of Ontario that doesn't have a city centre. But we are sandwiched actually between Ottawa and Kingston, and that presents advantages and disadvantages for our young people, and I can talk about that as I roll along. But all that to say, I think rural Canada has significant assets, but also challenges when it comes to finding supports for some of our young people, and housing is certainly one of those issues. So just a little bit about Cornerstone. We are a registered charity. It was actually started in Perth by a group of community members who were concerned about the lack of services for folks who were homeless or experiencing housing insecurity. And so most of those people were connected to churches at the time, and they were looking for support from churches to be able to build a emergency shelter at the time. And they were looking at all genders, all ages. And so it was kind of the coming together of 2 groups, including the Transitions Action Coalition at the time, which was a community coalition of service providers focused on youth homelessness that came together with that group and created Cornerstone Landing. Cornerstone Landing used to be called Cornerstone Landing Emergency Residence, but it's now called Cornerstone Landing Youth Services. We decided to sort of narrow the focus to youth, and eventually we abandoned the notion of a shelter altogether. So I can talk about that as we go along. But so Cornerstone, just some stats on Cornerstone Landing. Cornerstone supports anywhere between about 70 and 85 kids a year. It's a little up and down every year, depending on new referrals. But and some of those are young people that we've supported for as long as 6 or 7 years now, since we started doing this, and some are just new referrals. So as you'll see on the stats on the screen now, 73 young people in 2019, and 42 of those were new referrals. The rest were actually carryover from the year before or the year before that as well. So we don't have a time frame on our services. We will support young people as long as they want to. We're a voluntary service, so they don't have to work with us, but we're here to support them. And it's quite common for us to have young people call us up or be referred to us. We support them for a few months or with some immediate needs, and then they disappear and they call us back a year later. So, or we find out from someone else, you know, they're often doing their own thing and fine. So, and we're completely flexible that way. So a significant stat, again, I think in the reason why we started again, was that really vulnerable group of 16, 17-year-olds. And so consistently about 50%, it's been as high as almost 70% at times, are 16, 17-year-olds that we get referrals for and that we support, which is really concerning. Again, those 16, 17-year-olds are pretty vulnerable, and connecting to some services can be challenging. You know,
They also have to be in school full-time when they're accessing things like OW. And so it's a particularly challenging group in terms of the services and the supports that we offer them or don't offer them. So in terms of stats in Lanark County, we have about 43% of our young people have come from Smith Falls. That's actually a really interesting change for us. Referrals from Smith Falls used to be about 70% to 80% of our referrals every year. But what's happened, we found over the last year or two, is that the housing crisis that we're experiencing even in Lanark County with the increasing house prices has really balanced the scales in a sad way, in the sense that our referrals are coming now from all over the place, including, I didn't do the breakdown for townships, but we're starting to get referrals from townships as well, kids moving into town to access apartments, but coming from Montague and Beckwith and Tay Valley. So, in 2019, only 43% of our young people are from Smith Falls, which is significantly lower, and about 20% from Carleton Place and 20% Perth. The rest were all Almont and surrounding townships. So you'll notice something which I find interesting, and certainly based on this presentation today, the majority of our kids access Ontario Works. So again, at 16, 17 years old, many kids can't access or don't want to access the services of a child welfare agency. So as of 2 years ago, the province of Ontario changed the Child Welfare Act to allow kids who are 16, 17 to apply for what's called a VISA, so a Voluntary Youth Services Agreement, which provides them with support, and it's a voluntary contract that they sign to enter into services with the local Children's Aid Society. So you'll see there's about 17% of young people accessing that now, but many young people choose not to. They don't want to be, they either have a history with the CIS and they don't want to revisit that, or it just brings up old stuff for them, or they don't want to go through the process of approval, which still requires an investigation essentially of your family. And so lots of young people don't want to go through that process. So, but interestingly, only about 7% of our young people are on ODSP that we support. And we think that's significantly lower than it should be. So one of the big hurdles we have, and I'll talk about a little bit later, is just the lack of appropriate diagnosis for young people to access the services that they actually need. So we think that should actually be a lot higher. And then 26% of our kids have no income. So that could be a young person who's staying with their partner at their partner's parents' house. That could be the young person who's staying with their grandparents and do not want to apply for OW or ODSP. And so they have some other person in their life providing them with financial supports. That's not always a positive thing. Sometimes it's a young person staying in an abusive relationship, but typically it's about 20% to 25% that we see that with. Out of those kids, out of those 42 new referrals, we actually had 26% had part-time employment as well. So on top of all these financial supports they have in place, they are actually still working as well part-time. So about 1 out of 5 of those kids. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were just talking about this before the presentation, many of our young people that we support actually lost their part-time jobs. And so we've been providing additional financial support to them to help them out in the last couple of months. But it is a significant issue for us that kids typically have to be able to have a part-time job if they want to afford an apartment. So on Ontario Works, kids make about $720 a month total. ODSP is a little bit over $1,100, and so you've got anywhere between $400 and $600 a month for apartments. And we've seen a 1-bedroom in Lanark County go from about $650 a month to about $900 to $1,000 a month for a 1-bedroom. So our young people are really, really challenged right now to pay for the rents. So one of the services we do offer that's really important at Cornerstone Landing, beyond the frontline staff support we offer, we are right now putting out over $30,000 a year in rent supplements to young people. It's been a component of our program right from the beginning in 2012 when we started this program, but it's a really important piece of that. And we found that over the last year or two, it's gone up and up because the rents are just so high for kids, so they just cannot access an apartment if we don't provide them with some support. So the scary part for us as a nonprofit is that we have very little sustainable funding. So the pressure's on for us always to be fundraising and to be finding more sources of income to be able to help out, because once you start offering those rent supplements to young people, you can't take them away or you're going to end up with a whole lot of homeless young people again. So I'm going to talk a little bit in this presentation. I think it's important to talk about housing first. So I'm going to get into that, but we adopted a housing first model. I'm going to talk in the next slide about what that means, but essentially the basics are that you provide housing to young people with supports, young people, old people. Housing first applies to any demographic, but and so we keep really comprehensive data and statistics on the type of housing our young people access, when they access it, how long it takes us to find them housing, those sorts of stats, and it really helps inform what we do and how we do it. We also keep track of what type of housing they access. So years ago, we recognized that room rentals were really problematic for young people. And so we started to really look for more individual bachelor one-bedroom apartments. But unfortunately, a trend we've seen again over the last year or two with the rising house prices is that it's been harder and harder for kids to access one-bedroom apartments and bachelor apartments. So they've had to resort back to room and board conditions. And it's just fraught with all kinds of problems. So, you know, just even in the last couple of months, we've had bed bug outbreaks in a house with, you know, 5-6 people in it, and renting couches out, and you know, cockroaches in a house with a boarding house as well. And so it doesn't just affect one person, then it affects the entire house and the entire building, including our kids. So, unfortunately, regardless, we you know, get a roof over their heads as soon as we possibly can. They primarily choose what type of housing they want. We certainly don't direct traffic in that regard, other than to provide them with their options, and then we provide them with supports. But the really good news for us is that it works. So we adopted the Housing First model about 5 years ago, and just some independent statistics outside of our agency, the County of Lanark did a count in, I can't see the year on it, but I think it's 2016. And then 2 years later did another count. So what that means is people go out on the streets, the agencies are all trained in how to do this, and they survey the people that they know of in their community who are homeless. Could be couch surfing, could be sleeping outside, could be in a boarding house, could be in a hotel. So what we found is that by adopting Housing First, we saw within about a 2 to 3 year period, a reduction of almost 70% in youth homelessness, which is really great validating information for us to say that the model works, and that that's what we need to keep doing and do more of. So, so that's why we've adopted that model. So Housing First. And the reason why I talked about this in this presentation and thought it was important to talk about is because I also asked a question in the survey that Rob circulated for me before this. And if you see on the bottom there, it says 7 out of 10 folks who answered the survey had said that their young person could probably handle an apartment with supports. That might be the best housing option for them when they move out into independence. And so that really is what Housing First is about. And certainly if you do any research around homelessness, housing insecurity, and FASD, you'll find that housing with supports is one of the adopted best practices. And so we do know that young people with FASD are going to be at higher risk of housing insecurity. Some of the challenges they find in terms of behaviors or history with the youth criminal justice system, or those sorts of things that we see with young people, can make it harder to house and to find stability. But definitely housing with support seems to be the best model that works for many of those young people. So Housing First, just the basics. Housing First is the internationally recognized best practice for addressing housing and homelessness. And so it came out of the States actually as a model, and there's been lots of research done on it. And the largest research study in the world was actually done in Canada. Dr. Tim Aubry, who's with the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, was one of the researchers on that project. And so they had over 2,100 participants in it, and they took folks who were chronically homeless. So chronically homeless means at least 6 months on the streets, who also had a significant medical issue, and also at least one, if not comorbid mental health issues or psychiatric issues. And they placed them into housing with supports. So they used primarily scattered site private housing. So in other words, they rented apartments spread out across the cities and placed folks in them as a legal tenant. So the tenants actually signed leases, and then they provided with them the supports that they needed in their housing. And what they found is that compared to what they call treatment as usual, so in other words, having someone in a shelter and having them have to go through programs and work on their sobriety and mental health issues and then go into housing, to compare those two models and approaches, they found that there was significant benefits to Housing First. So people were typically able to maintain their housing at a much more consistent rate than they were if we used the sort of regular model, the adopted model at that time, which was shelters first and then housing. And so, you know, again, this research has been replicated around the world. It's just not something you can even argue with. It is definitely better to put folks into housing and wrap them in supports there. So the basics of Housing First, though, is that housing is unconditional. So you just assume that every single person can have and should have housing. It's a human right. There's no preconditions. So you don't say you have to go to drug treatment first and then we'll give you housing. You just put them into housing and then provide them with supports. And if they have to go to drug treatment, they do after the fact, and you bring them back to the same housing unit. there has to be choice. So people should have an option to choose what type of housing they want. So often, and I can talk about this in Lanark County when it comes to the barriers, but often what happens in Lanark County is that we have very limited choice in the types of housing we offer folks. And so the same type of boarding house gets offered to a person over 4 or 5 years. And then people say, well, they've been offered supports, but they're sleeping outside, they're choosing to do that. Well, I would argue they're not choosing to do that. Homelessness is not about choosing. It's actually about the lack of choices people have. And so the more choices we give people, the better able it is to place them and to find housing and sustain their housing. So tenancy rights. So again, they sign leases. They have a legal right to the apartment. It's not based on a condition that they follow the program. All services are voluntary. So even if they refuse services, they're still provided with housing. They have guaranteed rent support. So again, they're not living in, well, I would argue they're still living in poverty, but they at least have rent supports so that they're not, spending 100% of their income on housing. So that's the basics. And it really does still challenge people to this day. When I speak publicly, lots of people will still talk from the perspective that, well, they don't really deserve housing. They can't handle housing. And I would say that even professionals are still at risk of making those sorts of statements. They're not ready for housing. I think they need something else. But again, the very basic premise of Housing First is that every single person, regardless of circumstances, mental health or medical, is ready for housing and should have housing. Now, is there flexibility to what type of housing that is? Yes, for sure. So it could be a boarding house, it could be supported living, it could be a group home. But typically, Housing First is really meant to be about a tenant's legal rights to have a house over a roof over their head, and to have their own home. So, and again, so that's the model we adopted, and it's worked really effectively for us in Lanark County. So. And again, just 7 of your 10 folks in your survey had actually supported that notion, which was good for me to see. So what are the gaps? I promise I won't end on the negative. There's some good services and supports coming up, but there are definite gaps, and certainly in rural communities, we know that there's some challenges specifically, starting with a lack of funding, I think, for one, which would address a lot of these issues, but we definitely have a lack of choice and options for folks here. So one of the things you may have seen in the press that Cornerstone has been working on is gentle densification options. And so what that means is things like using secondary units and tiny homes. So instead of always focusing on multi-unit complexes of 20, 30, 40 units or housing subdivisions, we're looking at more simple options for folks to be able to adopt quickly. And I think actually those housing options that we've been working on, like secondary units, are actually really applicable to this group, in the sense that when we started talking about tiny homes and secondary units, we had a lot of people reaching out to us from a variety of demographics, including seniors, parents with children with disabilities, and mental health issues, where they wanted an option to build a house on their property, a tiny house or secondary unit, and be able to use that for their aging young person who's moving into independence but couldn't quite be on their own. They also wanted an affordable housing option, so even people with senior parents, the parents didn't necessarily want to live in their house but wanted a bit of a separate option, but also on the same property because it's more affordable. So that's why Cornerstone, after doing all this work for a few years, actually started looking and exploring at some of these models that didn't require multiplexes. So we also lack, beyond that, any sort of comprehensive emergency response to housing and homelessness right now in Lanark County. Currently, if you have a person who is over the age of 16 who becomes homeless, adults included, you would call the County of Lanark during business hours. Otherwise, you would call Victim Services in Lanark County, and you would refer them to them, and they would provide potentially a hotel room for 1 to 4 or 5 days at the most. And the problem with that model is not that they give you a hotel room, it's the fact that at the end of the 3, 4, 5 days, you're back out on the streets if you don't have an option at that point. So they will not extend funding typically. So we've definitely had to do that dance a little bit with young people, for sure, where they present to us as homeless, they don't have any options or natural supports available, and so they end up in a hotel room. And in 3 or 4 days, they can end up back out on the streets. And that's definitely happened over the last few years with young people. So last year was probably the worst year as an advocate I've ever seen in Lanark County for the amount of people we've had sleeping outside. We've had families in RVs and people in cars and people sleeping under bridges and under tarps and parks, and all kinds of kids in shacks and tents outside, and tent encampments growing in certain towns. So it's definitely been a really unfortunately, we're kind of going backwards as a result of just the housing prices, I think. So So all that to say, we need definitely in Lanark County a better emergency response, but that is the current option right now, is to access a hotel for a few days. And so with our young people, when they come to us, and this has always been our model, we always start with natural supports. So if we get a referral from a teacher for a young person who's say 17 or 18 years old, we will automatically say to them, do you have anywhere you can stay temporarily right now? And what can we do if you do have that to support that? So we've actually given rent supplement money or food money or gift cards to the parents of a friend who will take them in for a few weeks, or a grandmother who's on a fixed income who can't afford to have them, but we can financially support that, at least as a temporary placement for us to be able to bridge the gap to finding long-term housing. And so sometimes those placements, luckily, some of those placements turn into long-term placements when they recognize that they can actually have some financial support. And as far as we're concerned as an agency, the last thing we want to do is pull young people into a housing system if they don't need to be there. So if they have natural supports or extended family members who are willing to support them, and all they need is a little help from us, we're more than happy to do that. So we do have a significant portion of our young people who access extended family members or what we call natural support. So in terms of supportive housing in Lanark County, we do have boarding houses, and boarding houses are also used as emergency housing in Lanark County. So although you can have a long-term placement in a boarding house, the county will also use it as emergency housing. So if a hotel is not available, sometimes a room in a boarding house will be used for a week or 2 weeks or 30 days. The unfortunate reality for a lot of the boarding houses in Lanark County, most people don't realize this, but if you stay there long-term, they can cost anywhere from $1,500 and up. And we have as many as sometimes 26 to 30 people in the boarding houses, with maybe 1 or 2 staff on at a given time. And so we do have a lot of young people who absolutely refuse to go to boarding houses, or they only stay for a week or 2 and then they leave. They just are not comfortable living there. It's just not what they consider a healthy place to be for them. So some kids, again, when it comes to that choice, perceived choice, will say, I don't want to stay there, I'd rather stay outside, which I can totally understand, quite frankly. So gentle density I've already talked about, and just that basis of choice in Housing First is really important. So lack of diagnosis is another significant issue, and I think that speaks to this presentation today. We know we have supported many and are supporting many young people right now with FASD, but they do not have appropriate diagnosis. Or accurate diagnosis. And I think that's true of probably most mental health issues. And once a young person turns 16, 17 and then transitions into the age of 18, it's really hard for them to access the adult services and also access the funding and supports they need when they don't have a proper diagnosis. So it's really important for us, even when we're working with 16, 17-year-olds, to do whatever we can to advocate for them to be able to access those assessments and proper mental health supports, so that when they transition, they've got the best case to be able to advocate for the right supports and services for them. So for example, again, the difference between OW is $720 a month and ODSP is $1,100 plus. And so they also get an ODSP worker typically when they get diagnosed or put on the ODSP system. So that's another person that can act as a support person for the young people too. So we do whatever we can to advocate for that, but it's really hard when you're dealing with, we deal also with a lot of young people who have been in care before. And so what we find is there's a lot of missing history from young people that just hasn't been passed on along with them. And it's hard to actually access a family member who can share that history with you and help them navigate that process. So again, lack of diagnosis has a significant impact on the young people that we work with in being able to access proper supports, services, and financing as well. So lack of funding, again, funding is a huge issue. And I've actually have had that happen with parents who've called me up with young people who are diagnosed with FASD and they're looking for supports. And parents can be, and long-term supportive caregivers can be, the best asset any young person can have. Unfortunate when it comes to funding models, this is one of the biggest flaws we have in our system right now, is that if a young person does not have an appropriate diagnosis to be able to qualify for ODSP, or if they have parents at home who are saying, no, I want my young person home, I want to support my young person, it's really hard for those young people, for us at Cornerstone Lanark, to support those young people, because they may not be able to access things like OW and those other sorts of financial supports. To qualify for VISA or OW, essentially you have to have a parent who's not willing to have you live with them. So that has put parents in really horrible, awkward positions before, where they have a young person they really care about, they're trying to provide supports, they're trying to advocate, but the system is designed to say that if your family wants you to live at home, then we will not provide you with the support, that's where you need to be. But we all know that there's lots of reasons why young people can't be at home sometimes. And so it puts parents in a really, I think, a really inappropriate position to have to say, I'm going to abandon my child so that they can access the financial supports and services they need. And I think that's a really unfortunate part, actually, of this system so far. And like I said, to access the VISA, which also provides more financial support and also physical supports from staffing, you have to be willing to go through an investigation. And lots of young people at the age of 16 or 17 have either already been through that process with CAS in the past, or just aren't willing to do that at this point and to open up those issues and explore those issues with their families. So they just refuse to do the VISA, which again would provide more financial supports and staffing. But so they rely on Ontario Works, which is really unfortunate because again, it's just so underfunded. It's completely inadequate to support young people. So supports and services, this is the better part, I hope. And please keep me on track, Rob, if I speak too much. So supports and services. So again, best asset for young people in any circumstances is supportive and consistent caregivers. And that's true even if we end up having a young person come into a housing situation, their family is still really important to them, their extended family is still really important to them. It's one of the reasons why I, as a housing advocate, fight for services in every community, including rural, remote communities. I believe that we should not force people to have to leave their communities to access services because it disconnects them from their natural supports and their extended family and their consistent caregivers. And so we really need to be advocating for supports and services to be able to serve people in their home community if that's where they want to be. If they want to leave, that's their choice. But if they want to stay, we should that should be an option for them before. Just quickly, one of the reasons again that the Transitions Action Coalition was started 20 years ago was because the only response we had to youth homelessness at that time was to put kids on Greyhound buses and drop them off in the city. And they wouldn't get dropped off at a shelter, they get dropped off at the bus shelter, and then they have to find their own way at the age of 16 or 17, some of them having never been in a city before, to the nearest shelters, which were often full. And so then kids would end up being street homeless in the city because that's the only option we thought we had for them. So, so part of the reason all this advocacy and these agencies have developed over the last few years is to try to stop that process from happening and keep young people in their community connected to their teachers, their neighbors, their parents, their extended families. So. Programs and supports that assist with independent living and independent living skills and daily living. And so any of those programs that young people can access are of huge benefit. And there's a variety of those that are offered periodically around the county. Adult Learning, you'll see actually Adult Learning and Training Center offers programs. Open Doors, I think, has a youth group as well that offers programs. Adult Mental Health is offering programs as well. So any of those supports and services that will help kids with the day-to-day living experiences is really important, like money management. So one of the services we offer at Cornerstone Landing too is to act as a trustee for young people. So we will help them with their money management pieces for sure. So, and then underneath you'll actually see a whole list of all the funding and supports that's available in Lanark County. So VISA is something I talked about through Children's Aid Society. Lillian Goodmanson is one of those folks who will help young people transition from 17 to 18 years old into the adult system. Open Doors has a youth transitional worker as well who will work with kids who've been in care before transition. Pathways Out of Poverty is a really great program as well, offered through the Adult Learning Center, and then Algonquin College as well. And they're actually offering, most of these services are actually offering all online services right now too because of COVID-19. So it's a great opportunity for kids to be able to access some of these services right from home. So. And that's Cornerstone Landing. So those are our two housing caseworkers who work directly with young people. You're welcome to call them and they will go through the intake and the process, and they will even chat with parents as well about what services are not available for folks in the county. But they are both, in my opinion, rock stars, and I don't know how we would do what we do without them. So great people with great experience and just brilliant at working with the kids. So.
Thank you very much, Terrilee. That was an excellent presentation. I think the part that really jumped out me the most was the earlier section with the housing first. And it really struck me that what you're facing there, we see in a lot of different avenues in terms of it's this idea of choice. Yeah. That just like someone doesn't choose to be blind, just like someone doesn't choose to, they're not going to choose to be depressed. They're also not going to choose to behave in the way that they do, and they're not going to choose to be homeless. Mm-hmm. And so the comment that you made about it's not based on punishment or reward, that we're going to give the housing first and put that foundational aspect in there, and then we're going to work from there. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for that.